Welcome to the Traveling Professors. I'm Professor Bob.
And I'm Professor Sheri.
And together we are
the Traveling Professors.
Today's walking tour is the Versailles Palace. Now this will just be the palace. The garden and the Trianons will have their own separate program. So let's get started. Now, Versailles did not become the main palace of France until Louis XIV. Originally, as you see here, it was a hunting lodge for Henry IV, but that was just a very small hunting lodge. It's Louis XIII that really expands it. The beginning of the 1600s, actually Versailles was simply a village surrounded by marshes and woodland. There was plenty of game, and Henry IV and Louis XIII enjoyed hunting. But Louis XIII bought a local manor farm, which in due course he had reconstructed by Philibert Leroy in 1631 to 1634. The result was a small rose brick and stone chateau consisting of a main building and two wings, which can still be seen in the marble court at its centers, and the gardens then surrounded the chateau. Now you see the artwork of the real expanse of the palace. Louis XIV came to the throne at 5 and took over at the age of 23 in 1661. In the intervening years, he had grown attached to his father's chateau and determined to enlarge it, and also outstrip the country mansion at Vaux-le-Vicomte of Fouquet, his finance minister. To this end, he commissioned the three who had been working for Fouquet: Lavaux the architect, Lebrun the decorator, and Lenotre the garden designer, and they are simply to reconceive the palace at Versailles. Now, Louis XIII's construction was too small to be enlarged. The land was too wet to grow plants satisfactorily, and there was a lack of water for fountains, which was an integral part of the 17th century garden. But those kind of details meant nothing to the Sun King, who shifted land, had it drained, and began to build. In 1678, Jules Mansart, aged 31, took over the project as architect, a post he was to occupy until he died 30 years later. By 1685, 22,000 workmen with 6,000 horses were working on the site under his direction, as well as Lebrun and Lenotre. Such numbers are understood when it is appreciated that the installation of 1,400 fountains, today of which there are only 600, required the diversion of the river Bièvre and 37,000 acres of land to be drained, and bedding plants initially numbered 150,000 a year, and then ultimately 3,000 orange, pomegranate, and myrtle trees were moved seasonally into the orangery, and 100 statues were commissioned by Lebrun in the gardens alone. Now here we see an aerial view of Versailles today. Now at the time, Louis XIV and Louis XV, the court numbered about 3,000. There were also thousands of soldiers that were in the town. Servants were housed in palace annexes, and the nobles and their servants and families lived in the palace itself, while the lesser nobility frequented the precincts in hope of recognition by the king, for whom favors, riches, positions, and everything else took place. Now he encouraged this attraction as a means of keeping his nobles under his eye and control, and encouraged their rivalries, palace-seeking fashion, gambling to distract their attentions from political dissension, and life at the court was carefully regulated. You have a situation where he gave the nobles jobs, and the highest-ranking noble used to be the royal hunting friend. Well, now the highest-ranking noble's job is in the morning when the king is getting up and dressing and performing what is called his toilette. This noble would come in and take the chamber pot from underneath the king's bed, take it and empty it, and then clean it out, then bring it back and replace it. The symbolism is that even the greatest noble is no more valuable than the king's own excrement. So it is quite an interesting situation. Now here we have a map showing the palace and the Grand Canal and the Petit Canal and the Trianons. And what I want to do here is talk about what happened after the Revolution. Now it ceased to be the royal residence after 1789. The execution of Louis XVI marked the start of Versailles', shall we say, spoliation. The furniture was auctioned off. The fine art was removed to the Louvre. The palace fell into disrepair, and the gardens were absolutely abandoned. Now, the rot was only stopped by Louis Philippe, who gave 23 million francs from his own personal fortune towards the palace's rehabilitation and conversion into a museum to the glory of France. Napoleon stayed out of the Trianon and the Petit Trianon. The restoration has continued ever since. since, particularly after the 1914-1918 World War I, with a tremendous amount of money given by John D. Rockefeller, and more since 1950. Now, 1950 is important because that's when the real restoration was undertaken. It installed central heating, electric lighting, and generally refurbished the other landmarks, including the restoration of the Royal Opera, the King's Bedchamber, and the Hall of Mirrors, to all their original splendor. So it has taken a while to do that, and they continue to make changes. This is one thing that's important to understand. You could go to Versailles at a time and visit it, and then go back 5 years or 10 years later, and things may have changed. Now, I've seen Versailles 3 times. Was there in 1987. We got a quick tour with the school group on the interior. Didn't get to the exterior. Sheri and I then, 2012, went here on our honeymoon and visited during the time which they had 18 inches of snow on the ground. And I noticed then that some of the rooms were different than they were when I was there before. And what happens is these rooms have multiple uses over the time period that the palace has been in existence. And so sometimes they make changes to make everything fit in the same category. What used to be a guard room at one time period suddenly becomes another room at another time period. It's not like it didn't happen. It's just that some of these rooms had 4 different options of use, so they may be set up differently. I forgot to say the third time we visited. The third time was in 2016, and we spent the whole time out in the garden looking at the tree and all. So that was our third trip. So let's begin our tour. We took the train from Paris out to Versailles and then walked to the main palace, as you can see here. Not all the rooms were open that day because of the snow. Not everybody could get in, but most of the public rooms were open. So we go heading towards the main entrance, and then you go through the gate. This is a backside view of the gate. And then there was security at that time. You had to go through different type of security. They've changed the security. This building that was out in the quadrangle has been removed. And so then you're heading into this courtyard area, and then you will enter through the buildings over here, and the first thing you will come into on the ground floor is the chapel. Here's a view of the Chapel of St. Louis from the second floor. Now, it's dedicated to St. Louis, the ancestor of the kings of France. But this is the 5th chapel to have been built at the Chateau of Versailles. The other chapels were simply too small. It was not until 1699 that new plans were presented by Mansart, and his brother-in-law, Robert de Cotte, completed the building in 1709. Now, since this chapel was consecrated on the 5th of June, 1710, it really was not here that the principal religious ceremony of Louis XIV's life at Versailles took place. However, from this time on, besides daily masses, were ceremonies of the Order of the Holy Spirit. All baptisms and marriages of the children of France and the princes of the blood were indeed celebrated here. And among the most interesting marriages to take place were the marriage of Louis XV's son, the Dauphin, who married, ultimately Louis XVI, who married Marie Antoinette in 1770. So it's a fascinating little building. After coming into the building, we have the floor here where we're looking down where the nobles would have been. And you see a little group of people. That's a private tour. And we're not on the private tour. But you get a nice view. Here's a good shot of the altar, the beautiful organ. Then we go upstairs to the first floor. A really good shot of the organ. And the ceiling painting, which is the work of Jouvin, Coppel, and Lafosse, is evoking the doctrine of the Trinity along its various parts. Now, this view, that you see here, is where the king and the queen sat. This is where the king and the queen had their service. And this beautiful Savonnier carpet, which was put in 1760 and has only recently been returned from the Louvre to take its place back in this area. Now, one of the interesting things about this business with the church and the chapel is that when the king is in the chapel and the chapel exterior, the antechamber, he is accessible to anyone to be approached with a request. So it's pretty open. So he's going to have quite a bit of guard action. Now, you'll find Swiss guards here. You'll also find the King's Musketeers. And here's a closer view of the beautiful Savonnier carpet. From the same level that we were viewing the chapel, we can go down and view the Royal Opera. Now, the construction on the Royal Opera began in 1768, and it was opened 2 years later at the wedding of the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette. The interior was built of wood, and it has excellent acoustics, and it's painted to look like green and rose marble. Now, it took 5 years to restore the opera to its present splendor, and in 1957, the opening performance was attended by Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Here's a chart showing the first floor plan. We're heading towards the yellow area, which is what is known as the stage apartments. And then we will go down to the orange area, which is the Hall of Mirrors with the guard rooms on either side. And then the green area is where you find the Queen's apartments. Now, 14, 16, and 18, those are private, just like the King's apartments, which you see in the gray. And then you also see the purple. The purple are private apartments. So again, the people we probably saw down taking the private tour of the chapel will end up taking the private tour of the King and the Queen's apartments as well. And then we'll finish on this floor with the area where we have the red, and that's going to be the sacred salon, the room of 1792, the staircase of the princes, and the gallery of battles. The Hercules Room, which is the first floor and the first floor of the chateau, was the site where the fourth chapel stood from 1682 until 1710. This room lies at the juncture of the central section and the north wing, and its decoration was begun, I should say, in 1712 by Robert Descotes. It's a drawing room, and it's the largest in the chateau. It was not only a passage for the king on his way from the royal apartments to the chapel, but it was also a ballroom and served also as an audience chamber. And the name of the room comes from the gigantic painting on the ceiling of the life of Hercules, and that is 3,390 square feet of painting. Now we come to the Venus Salon, which is actually the first of a series of planetary salons that are named because the ceiling has an appropriate painting that goes with that particular deity. So what you end up, the name of Venus, the first deity in the mythological cycle decorating the state apartments, was given to this room because of the ceiling by Huas, depicting the goddess of love subjugating the gods and powers. And in the corners of the room, they have various famous lovers of antiquity, but you also have this gigantic statue of Louis XV inset in the wall. The Diana Room, or Diana of the Hunt, dedicated to Apollo's sister, the goddess of night, in the center of the ceiling, depicted by Blanchard as she presides over both hunting and navigation. The Diana Room was originally used as a billiards room. The billiard table was covered with gold-fringed crimson velvet, stood in the center of the room, and the ladies of court could follow the game, at which Louis XIV excelled. Now there is also this beautiful bust of Louis XIV inset in the walls there, and that's done by Bernini. The Mars Room was originally a guard room, but in the center of the ceiling is the god of war, painted by Audrien. At the time of Louis XIV, the fireplace was flanked by two galleries of musicians who played on the apartments in the evenings for the Mars Room. After being used as a game room, it was then transformed into a concert hall or a ballroom on occasion. Well, those galleries were removed by Louis XV, and it was during his reign that the great portraits of the king and queen by Van Loo were hung there. The portrait of Maria Lescheka was returned. And this beautiful red that you see in what is known as the Mercury Room is the king's bedchamber, Louis XV's bedchamber, but only while he was waiting for his new bedchamber to be completed. In the corner of this picture, you see this clock. That is the famous pendulum or clock cabinet. It's an astronomical clock made by Passimont in 1754, which marks the hours, the days of the week, the date of the month, the months, the years, and the phases of the moon. But this is where Louis XV slept for a brief period of time. It is also the room where Louis XV's body lay in state after he had died. The Apollo Room was undergoing significant reconstruction. Now, it is the former throne room, and now it is returned with the little throne and everything in there. And it was the most sumptuous of all the planetary series because Louis XIV saw himself as Apollo, god of wisdom, prophecy, light, and arts, which is why on the ceiling you have this La Fosse painting of Apollo in his sun chariot attended by the seasons. It is just stunning. And underneath it, you would have had the throne. Once you leave the Apollo Room, you're no longer in the king's apartments. You're in the section that deals with the Hall of Mirrors, so you have a room on either end of it. And before we go into what is known as the War Salon, or the opposite one is known as the Peace Salon, we have to look at the doors. Look at the locks on these doors. I mean, triple deadbolts on this. So, man, when you lock a door in this place, it stays locked. Then you go into the main room here, the War Salon, and this is where the king would have celebrated his victory victories. The ceiling shows the king being crowned by the goddess of war and triumphant over his enemies. And there's actually markings in different parts of the wall showing different enemies of France. But then you can see, as you're looking through the room, the Hall of Mirrors beckons on the other end. Well, let's get our bearings as to where we are. We've just finished being in the war salon. So we're going to go into the Hall of Mirrors, and then from the Hall of Mirrors, we have the entryway into the king's bedchamber and several of his other rooms. So we'll be going into this region, and then we'll exit back out and go to the queen's area. Well, we finally come to the most famous hall in the palace, and it must have been absolutely fantastic when the king and queen in full dress moved amongst their court beneath lighted chandeliers. Remember, it's not electrically lit until the 1950s. It is 75 meters long and 10 meters wide, so that's 246 feet by 33 feet. Now, it gets light from those 17 windows. It's reflected into the 17 mirrors of equal size on the opposite wall. Lebrun painted the ceiling in the glorification of the Sun King's early reign from 1661 to 1678. The hall of the setting is for the greatest of occasions, princely marriages such as Marie Antoinette and the future Louis XVI, receptions, festivals. At that time, the silver chandeliers would have been lit, flowers, orange trees, and silver tubs would have been dispensed, Savonnier carpets would have been laid, and everyone would appear in their finest clothing. Originals and copies of the gilded candelabras ordered by Louis XV now presently stand in the hall, as well as the crystal chandeliers. Now, this room was stripped of its furnishings in 1871 for Bismarck's proclamation of the King of Prussia as the Emperor of Germany. And then on June 28, 1919, it was used for the signing of the Versailles Treaty that ended the First World War. So it has quite a bit of history to it, to say the least. Here is a picture from a movie showing what the room would have looked like with everyone in their finery. The first picture I showed you of the Hall of Mirrors was taken just before a large group of people came in one great big group. And sometimes you just have to sit around and wait. So here is the view after they went in. It does take in a lot of people. You could probably fill that up and still wander around. Then here's Sheri and I with a selfie. We have to have a selfie while we're in here. And then here is the entire room. You can see the mirrors, chandeliers. And again, the people scattered everywhere is a close view of the chandeliers. And finally, they moved out, and we headed on down the hallway a little bit. Now remember, it's cloudy, and it is sprinkling a little bit of snow, but plenty of light in here with those windows. And then we turned around, and here comes another group of people. You would have thought that with 18 inches of snow on the ground, there would have been almost no one here, but that was not the case. Now, right where I'm standing and take this picture, to my right, where the gentleman is in the edge with his daughter, is the entrance to the king's bedchamber. Here is the entrance to the king's apartment, right off the Hall of Mirrors. And you can see from the chart that we've just entered into the gray section, and we'll be looking at the bullseye room, the king's bedchamber, and the council chamber. The purple area and the rooms that I did not mention, they're private, so we don't get to go into those. Now, the first room, as you come into, is the bullseye room. And this salon is called that because there's a false window in the form of a bullseye over the chimney piece. Originally, two rooms, Mansart and Robert Decote, created the present chamber, which makes a good comparison with those decorated at the beginning of Louis's reign. The style is lighter and more elegant. 3 busts decorate the salon. On the walls are family portraits and other various groups of family pictures. It's also where the courtiers assembled in this antechamber, waiting for what is known as the lever ceremony, or the king calling you in to do his morning toilet. So it's a place that you waited before an audience or before his dressing in the morning. Here we are entering the king's bedchamber. You come in through the door, you see the little heater up against the wall. Then you look out at the magnificent bed. Now, this originally was a state drawing room in 1701. Louis XIV had it turned into a bedchamber, and it's here where Louis XIV died in 1715. It's also, as you can see with the banisters there in front, that you have, this is where the king's famous rising and retiring ceremony ceremonies would have taken place. And there's a carving over the decor which says France is watching over the king in his slumber. And it was done by Cousteau, and it's set over the bed. It's quite nice. And as you get closer to it, they don't have the curtains opened very wide today, and they have it covered with plastic, so no one can jump in there and do a 1.5 and get on the bed. And then there's a view of the top of the canopy. And then we're going to be heading into the council room. Now, our last room to visit in the king's apartment is the council room, which originally was 2 rooms: the king's cabinet, where he held ministerial councils, and the cabinet of terms, named after the sculptures that once adorned it. That's where he and the princesses of the family would gather after an evening meal. And over a century, it was then changed into just a single room called the council room. And here, the most important decisions concerning the destiny of France were made. The decision to overthrow the alliances of 1756. And in 1775, France's participation in the American War of Independence. It was here, too, that the king granted his private audiences, signed royal marriage contracts, and received condolences or congratulations. On several occasions, he also received the ladies from the Halles Market in Paris in this room. So we have a nice table. We've got plenty of room in here to have our meetings, the beautiful mirrors, and the little dividers. So it's a beautiful little room. Well, we didn't get a chance to go into the private rooms. I did find a nice postcard because I like libraries. So here's Louis XVI's library. Gabrielle's elegant white and gold design, executed by the woodcarver Antoine Rousseau. The ensemble is a very successful example of what is known as the Louis XVI style, which started in 1774. So you have wonderful books, nice desk, table, fireplace. Sure would like to see what's on the shelves. You can see from our chart, we're on the end room from the Hall of Mirrors, which is known as the Peace Drawing Room, which is exactly the same size as the War Salon at the other end. Now, at the end of Louis XIV's reign, the Peace Drawing Room was made part of the Queen's apartment for Daphne de Bourgogne. From then on, it was the Queen's game room. Later, Maria Leschecka, Louis XV's wife, created the custom of holding concerts of sacred or secular music every Sunday. Then a partition was erected to fill the arch between this room and the Hall of Mirrors, and Marie Antoinette had a small theater created against this wall so she could pass the time while awaiting the birth of her child. And it has been a guard room as well, so it gets a lot of action. Now, the ceiling shows the apotheosis of France, the bringer of peace, which is why it's called the Peace Salon. The Queen's Bedchamber. This, as you see it today, is redecorated in the style of 1729 for Maria Leschecka. Now, in 1770, the 2-headed eagle of the House of Austria was added to the archings for Marie Antoinette. On becoming queen, she had the tapestry portraits of Louis XVI, her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and her brother Joseph II, placed above the mirrors in 1775. She ordered the present fireplace that's in there from 1783. And the summer wall hangings commissioned in 1786 was rewoven. It was here on the Queen's last night in Versailles on October the 5th, 1789. The canopy over the bed and the balustrade were carved as they once had been. In this bedchamber, 2 queens and 2 dauphinés had died, and 19 children of France were born. You come into the Queen's bedchamber, you see this door off the side, which allows her to access her private apartments, and it also allows her to access the king's apartments and the king hers. And here we are in the middle of the room, and look at the gorgeous setting. Of course, what you see here is when the queen gives birth, this room is full of men from the court who are there to make sure the child is healthy, that it's the sex that they claim it is, and then they all have to sign the birth certificate. So being a queen and having a private birth just doesn't happen. Here's a little closer view of it, and it's covered with plastic like the king's bed was, so people wouldn't climb over there and lay on it. And here's Sheri standing in front of the bed, and the beautiful ceiling in the room. So that is the Queen's bedchamber. Here's two of the Queen's private suites. We have the music room, and then this beautiful meridian room, the small octagonal boudoir by Marie Antoinette, was decorated in 1781 on the birth of the Dauphin, and the furnishings include blue silk hangings and George Jacob furniture. The clock was given to the Queen by the city of Paris, and the table was a present from her sister. The room of the Queen's gentlemen, or the Peers' Salon. It was here that the Queen greeted her audiences and had ladies recently admitted to the court presented to her. On these occasions, the sovereign's chair was placed on a dais opposite the window, and beneath a canopy supported by two bolts, still in the cornice to this day. However, it was here too that the coffins of the queens and the dauphinés who had died in the adjoining room were displayed. From the 18th to the 23rd in February 1712, an unceasing flow of people came to repay the respects for the bodies of the Dauphin and the Dauphinée, which are Louis XV's parents. Also in this room, the Queen generally received her ladies-in-waiting each morning, and the nobles would wait to meet her after her rising ceremony. For this reason, the room is called the Queen's Gentlemen. Of the original decor, only the ceiling, painted by Michel Corneille for Maria Theresa, remains as an original. All the rest was renovated for Marie Antoinette in 1785 on the birth of her second son. So you see there's Louis XVI's portrait. You have the whole room, beautiful rug on the floor, and then you have the original ceiling. Now this room has had a lot of different things put in it. This is a guard room, but it's also known as the antechamber of the Grand Couvert. During the time of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, once a week they would allow members of the court to come and watch them eat. And so you have paintings in here done by Lebrun of Marie Antoinette. You have this spectacular tapestry on the wall, and then you see the setting with the utensils where the king and the queen would sit, and then the servants would be on either side of them to help them. There's all of the plates and what have you, and there's a close-up showing the napkins folded as scallops, and their knife, fork, and spoon. And then the ceiling, the painting in the middle of the ceiling could not be restored, and in the 1800s they painted in what is known as Darius tent by Lebrun. But people would come in here and watch the king and the queen eat once a week. The last room in the Queen's apartment is known as the Queen's Guard Room, and it was here that revolutionaries broke into the palace in October the 6th, 1789, that the Swiss guards held them off long enough for the Queen to escape into the King's area before they were captured, but one of them was killed in the process. So you see the paintings on the wall and the ceiling. They're in the process of restoring it, so you can see the restoration work that's being done on it. But that's the Queen's Guard Room. Leaving the Queen's Guard Room, we go into what is now known as the Coronation Room. Now, it was actually a chapel from 1676 to 1682. Then it was turned into a guard room, then a meeting place for the Parliament when administering justice. Louis Philippe made alterations to accommodate several immense paintings commissioned for Napoleon the First coronation. On the left side of the entrance hangs the second version of David's Napoleon's coronation. The original is in the Louvre. You can always tell number 2 because she has this is the one that has the pink dress on. The one in the Louvre, everybody has the same color. It's all silver. On the other wall, you have the painting that is known as the army swearing loyalty to the emperor after the dispersion or distribution of the Eagle standards on the Champ de Mars, December the 5th, 1801, also by Jacques-Louis David. And the ceiling is painted. It's a raised ceiling, and it depicts the allegory of 18 Brumaire. That's when Napoleon overthrew the revolutionary government of the Directory. So that's the coronation room. After the coronation room, we walk through a little antechamber into the room that is known as the 1792 room. And that is hung with portraits of soldiers and battle scenes, Paris National Guard leaving for war, and all sorts of things. You see all these paintings of various generals, and then you see over the door this gigantic painting of Napoleon Bonaparte. Then once you leave the 1792 room, you go to across where we have the landing of the Prince's staircase, and you go to the Hall of Battles where we have paintings of all these battle scenes. And then once we finish with that, we're done for the day. We can't. There's nobody going out into the garden, so we're going to get something to eat. So we go back to the staircase and go there. You can see the ceiling, and I'm standing next to my hero Napoleon, and then we go downstairs to get lunch. It's right at the end of the hall. They have an Angelina's restaurant in the palace. Look at the pastries. Oh, you can get fat just standing there looking at them. So the restaurant is set in a suite of rooms that was used by one of the nobles at the time of Louis XIV. So we have our table is next to the window in the corner, so we can look out and watch working. And then here's the rest of the room, and the waitresses are all attired in the outfit that the lady servants wore at Versailles when they worked there. So we had a nice lunch, and then of course we have to use the restrooms, and here's the way the restrooms are marked at Versailles. I would point out that I always like to go to the restroom in every palace I can find, and Versailles were quite elegant. And then it's time to go back down the stairs, head out. Well, after leaving the palace, we just simply had to walk out through the gate, head back down through those buildings. Some of those have museums for the carriages and all sorts of other really neat things. And then we get back, there's the train station, back on our train. And here's Paris with ice on the road and snow everywhere. It was a wonderful time. We had a great time at Versailles, and seeing it with snow on it was special. Sheri and I hope you enjoyed the tour. Please come by our YouTube channel at Bob Packett on YouTube. It should be History According to Bob, but it comes up as Bob Packett. That's the easiest way to get to it. And please subscribe and leave some comments. Thank you very much.